Jesus has some seemingly harsh words for the people that are listening to him. And so just to set it in context, because we've been away from Mark for about 8 weeks or so, this is chapter 7. In chapter 6, he was pretty busy. He was the prophet without honor in his hometown. He sent out his 12 to heal. He recounted John the Baptist being beheaded. Jesus fed 5,000. Then he walks on water, all the while teaching and healing as he went. And as he was doing that, he was crossing the Sea of Galilee from one side to the other. And so chapter 7 picks up with him crossing back over the Sea of Galilee. So he is now on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. So to put this in perspective, geography-wise, if my feet down here is Jerusalem, Galilee is way up here, and that is where the Sea of Galilee is. And so they're on the west side of the Sea of Galilee by Capernaum, just south of Capernaum. It's about 78 miles from Jerusalem up there. So if you think this is the Sea of Galilee, they're over on the west side. Nazareth is here, Jerusalem is down here. Okay, kind of get that painted picture in your mind. So that's where they are. These Pharisees and scribes have left Jerusalem from the temple for which they are curators, and they have traveled 78 miles by foot to be alongside Jesus. It's quite a distance. It's kind of like us leaving now and walking to Davenport. Okay? They've walked a tremendous distance. They want to be where Jesus is, not necessarily to follow him, but to look over his shoulder and tell him what they think he's doing wrong. Okay? And so in verses 3 and 4, it says, "The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the traditions of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat anything unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles." In this day and age, we would understand that to be for hygiene purposes, right? It's good to wash our hands before we eat. It's good to wash our dishes that we use. But that's not what they're talking about here. This is not a hygiene issue here in the Bible. This is a ritual. This is a spiritual practice that God put in place in Exodus, and he talks about it in Exodus chapter 30 as well as chapter 40. And it says, for the priests only, they are to wash their hands and their feet before they walk up to the altar. So by the time they pass the pews, they're to stop here. There would be a basin for them to wash their hands and their feet before they go up to the altar. It was a ritual for cleanliness for the priests only. But somehow along the way, this has become a tradition, not just for the priests now, but for every Jewish person. So somehow, God's law turned into a tradition for all people. The tradition of the elders, or as Jesus referred to them as human traditions, came when the Pharisees believed that all people should wash their hands before eating to keep the meal and all meals sacred. The religious elite began to focus on external practices of faithfulness, and that became a means of excluding people from the group that were considered unclean or contaminated. It was used to put a fence up and exclude those that weren't following their tradition. This was not prescribed by God. It was for the priests to clean and be right before God before they went to the altar. And somewhere along the line, it turned into this tradition for all people. So Jesus' accusation to the leaders, which includes a quote from Isaiah, was not to condemn the law that God gave to the Israelite people through Moses, but rather to raise this overarching prophetic concern that God's people were neglecting the core issue of mercy for others. They were consumed by getting the human tradition correct, to get it right. Jesus said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you, hypocrites, as it was written. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. So he's scathing them that they've taken what God has given and has turned it into this law, this surrogate law of tradition rather than what God has given. And they're treating it as if it was scriptural. The Pharisees are not bad people. They get painted in some pretty ugly lights. But they're not bad people. They're trying to do what has been handed down to them for generation after generation. And as time has passed, somehow, as I say, this has turned in from being scriptural for the priests only, and now has just blossomed into this tradition that is supposed to be held by all people. And so they're regarding that as scriptural. And so they've lost sight between what God has given them and what human tradition is now asking them to do. They've inappropriately elevated human tradition over what God has given them. Thank goodness that doesn't happen in the church anymore. Laugh. It does, right? It happens all the time. Our human traditions overtake what God has given us. So a case in point, there's this great word I learned in seminary. It's called adiaphora. It's a Greek word, and it means all the things that we do that just don't matter, but we have fights over them anyway. Adiaphora. And it's this one word that just, when all us pastors get together and fight over silly things, one person will yell out the word adiaphora, and we all go, oh yeah, that's right. None of that matters. And we do that all the time. Case in point was not too long ago, about maybe 2 months ago, right after the Easter season Pentecost, we have a candle in the church that's called a Paschal candle. We don't actually have one here in this church. That's how important it is. Right? It doesn't stop worship. It hasn't for 100 years here. But it is a large candle that usually stands by the font and by the pulpit. I brought this one out because it's kind of like this, and it sits on a big pedestal. And it's lit just a few times a year. It is called the Paschal candle, which means Passover or Easter. So sometimes it's called the Easter candle. Sometimes it's called the Christ candle. Correctly, I suppose, it's called the Paschal candle. And so on this pastor's forum, there was quite an uproar of what we should call this candle. And so some says, who cares? And one person was like, no, this is the Paschal candle. And it must only be lit on certain days. Anytime I wear a white stole is usually when it is lit, as well as at funerals. It's usually put at the head of the casket, and during baptisms, because it's supposed to symbolize the light of Christ, the risen light of Christ. And one individual on this thing posting was adamant that the rest of us were a bunch of knuckleheads if we didn't agree with her position. And so I just wrote one word, adiaphora. It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. The things we do in the church and the sacredness of things that we do in the church do matter. I'm not tossing them out the window, but they have a place in amongst all things. And so this conversation went on with several days, and people getting quite rude with one another over the name of a candle and when it should be lit. We do this all the time to each other. Jesus says, smarten up. Stop it. Stop it. He says it's not that way. None of these types of things, candles and the names of them and when we light them and when we don't like them. It doesn't cause exclusion per se, but it does cause division. And division does end up causing exclusion. And it breaks the body of Christ. It breaks our community when we get caught up into these nuances of what worship should be, which is ultimately the worship of God when we come into this place. And we worship God through our music and our prayers and our words. And at the end of the day, that's what worship is. It's not whether we call that the Christ candle, the Easter candle, or the Paschal candle, or when it should be lit. Those things bring vibrancy to our worship, but it is not the purpose of our worship. And so Jesus is reminding the people and reminding us that when we come to things, it's ultimately about what God wrote in our scriptures that we need to be passing along, and not usurping God's word through our traditions. Because ultimately that will shun our neighbors. And so Jesus reminds us and brings us back to the 10 Commandments through that list of human vices that he uses. He says evil is much closer to home than we want to admit. That evil is residing in our hearts, and it can come out at any moment if we're not guarding against it. He says, then Jesus called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. And then he lists them all off: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, and folly. All of these things, he says, come from within, and they defile a person. It's not human tradition that defiles us, whether we wash our hands before we eat, because that was separating people out. It was dividing them. Our inner brokenness, our sinfulness, our sinful nature, when it's not held in check and we don't guard against it, our neighbor pays the price. I've said this several times, that the 10 Commandments come to us for the purpose of our neighbor having a better life. When I don't covet the things you have, when I don't tell lies about you, when I don't murder, your life is better. The same thing when you hold the 10 Commandments, my life is better. We're stronger in community when we uphold the 10 Commandments. And Jesus says all that stuff was getting in the way, and you were supporting human tradition instead of scriptural truths. I read a great statement this week. It says, you won't get closer to God by getting farther from your neighbor. Let me say that one again, because that one's good. You won't get closer to God by getting farther from your neighbor. We need each other. We are in community together. We are stronger together when we uphold the 10 Commandments, when we guard the evil that is very close to us, closer than we ever want to admit. We need to guard that and uphold the 10 Commandments so all of our lives are better in community. And Jesus is reminding us that sometimes the traditions of the church turn into human traditions, and we put those ahead of what God truly wants us to do, and that is authentic worship of Him. When we come in the doors on Sunday morning, it's authentic worship of Him. That's what He wants. He wants our whole heart, not part of it. He wants all of it, and He wants us to be worshiping Him, not ourselves, not our altar, not our Bibles, but God and God alone. And that's the message that Jesus is telling the people that were hearing that message that day. Remember, these Pharisees traveled a long way to show up Jesus, and they got a smackdown from Jesus to be reminded that no, it's what God gave us that we're to uphold and to worship God, God and God alone, not all the things that we have in these buildings. That is true and authentic worship, and that's what we try to do. For that we say amen.